I guess every man in history asks that question once in a while in relation to their loved ones. You see, I know my wife is cheating on me, she just doesn't know that I know. I had a fairly normal upbringing, 2 parents that loved me and an older sister who put up with me. My parents were big believers in equality and education, so I ended up at a private school. It was a strictly all-boys institution that emphasized football, religion, and education in that order. Next to our school was a private all-girls school which we had some interaction with. I can't tell you that there is anything worse than being at a Catholic school when you're not Catholic, except for being a middle-class or poor boy among snobby rich boys. To say I didn't fit in would be an understatement. I never liked snobs and still don't. I believe everyone is equal and should be judged by their actions, not their bank balance. Well, that was the wrong attitude at that school, and before long, I was picked on as the poor boy. I found myself in endless fights after school, both verbal and physical, often 4 or 5 against 1. I managed to land a few good punches, but generally I ended up on the losing side. I knew it was pointless to talk to my folks about it, as they would just tell me to turn the other cheek and fit in. The school insisted that everyone participate in a sporting activity either through the school or outside of it. Given the school's good connection with the police, due to the police chief's son attending the school, I decided to kill 2 birds with 1 stone and signed up for boxing classes run by the police boys club, which the school approved. This decision changed my life for several reasons. Firstly, the rich boys all played football and didn't want to mix with the lower class, so I ended up with kids just like me from all around town. The second and more important reason is that I met my best friend, Greg Sands. He was a talented boxer and the son of a cop. He had just arrived in town and signed up for class just for fun. The instructor had no idea that Greg was a regional boxing champion, and since we were of similar size, he paired us up for a sparring session. The last thing I remember before the lights went out was a smile and a big red fist coming at me. I woke up to white light in a room at the back of the gym with a sore head, wondering what had happened. The instructor stopped by and said he had assessed my talent and that it was going to be a long road. The next minute, Greg Sands came by to apologize for knocking me out. He extended his hand and we shook, becoming friends from that moment on. I took him around town, introduced him to my friends and family, and I met his folks as well. The surprise came the following week at school when, lo and behold, there was Greg in the hallway. I raced up to him with a grin and he returned it. It turns out that, due to his dad being the deputy chief, he got a reduced-cost education at the school. We became thick as thieves, taking many of the same classes together and being inseparable. As my folks like to say, Sam, as I came to call him, was like the brother I never had. The bully problem sorted itself out as well. Sam was giving me extra training, and combined with the twice-weekly classes, I was becoming a pretty decent boxer. It all came to a head one afternoon when Douglas Peterson started talking trash about my family. Now, I can take most things, but not when it comes to speaking that way about my loved ones. I went nuts, breaking Dee's nose and knocking some of his teeth out. The next moment, I saw all his friends coming up the rear. What they didn't see was Sam. To say it was an epic battle would be an understatement. Sam made short work of most of my foes while I was busy watching him and giving Douglas a few well-timed kicks in his ribs. Sam was always kind and loving towards his family and friends, but he was outright fierce with his enemies. We made short work of a few more reinforcements and left, thinking nothing more of it. I mean, they had done this sort of thing to me many times and I usually just let it go. I would then plot my revenge, often with 0 results. I guess it's never a good thing to make rich enemies. Douglas's father was a powerful man in industry and he was furious. He first had myself and Sam suspended for the remainder of the year. There was only a month left of classes anyway. He then had us charged with assault. What the captain of industry didn't reckon on were witnesses from the girls' school who totally backed our version of events, that Doug started the whole thing. It also helped that Sam's dad was the deputy chief. Mr. Peterson later tried to make my folks pay for the reconstructive surgery, but the assault charges were overturned, though the suspension remained in force for the rest of the month. I had to work at my dad's hardware store to keep me out of trouble. The summer before school started again was a good one. Sam and I hung out, hit the gym pretty hard, and took up running together. He tried to get to know my older sister, but she was about to leave for college and wasn't interested in anything with a high school student. Life went on pretty much like that for the remainder of school. Douglas Peterson vowed revenge, but I knew it wouldn't be physical as he had met his match and no one wanted to mess with Sam. In our last year of school, things were going well. Sam became the heavyweight state champion and I did okay, coming in the top 10 in my division. Sam seriously considered turning pro but didn't want to end up like his uncle who became broken and bitter from boxing. We were both beginning to date girls from the neighboring school, and now that we had cars, we spent a lot of time cruising around with our dates. I experienced my first intimate relationship with Susan Bates. While it wasn't love, it was certainly memorable. In the background, Douglas Peterson was watching me. He had never forgiven me for his humiliation. I never understood him. He had everything, money, looks, and power, but he was never happy unless he was hurting someone. Deep down, he was a coward, and he knew it. His revenge came swiftly that final year. He was under the mistaken impression that I was in love with Susan. Behind my back, he wooed her, and she ended up dumping me. The next thing I knew, he announced at school that Susan was now his girlfriend. It was a match made in heaven, as the Bates and Petersons were the two richest families in town. He had the look of a cat that got the cream every time he saw me. Sam and I laughed about it, knowing I wouldn't be going on to higher education as my family just couldn't afford it. So, decisions had to be made, and as usual, Sam and I discussed it. We both decided that the Army was the way to go and enlisted. We ended up missing the prom due to basic training, but it didn't bother either of us. As soon as we got to basic, I knew I wasn't cut out to be in the Army for any longer than my sign-up time. Sam, on the other hand, was born to be in uniform. He loved it. Basic was fine, I just did what I was told, and as usual, I had Sam helping me up if I fell. Finally, at the end of basic, we graduated and returned home for some rest and relaxation. I had 2 weeks before I had to report for officer training. I was going to be an officer and a gentleman. Sam teased me relentlessly about it, but I knew I was smart enough to pursue my business degree. Sam was going into special forces. I never doubted it. When he committed to anything, he followed through. This would be the first time in years that I wouldn't have my good buddy with me, and I didn't realize that I wouldn't see Sam again for many years. Officer training was a breeze. There was a lot of classroom work, but I enjoyed the practical work more. The most exciting thing for me was that once I completed officer training, I could start my business degree. I finished my training and suddenly found myself as Second Lieutenant Roger Easton. There were a couple of drawbacks regarding the business degree, though. Firstly, I had to commit more time to the Army, adding an extra 3 years on top of the 4 years I had initially signed up for. Secondly, I would be based out of the Army History Unit, which meant office work, and I wouldn't be out in the field anytime soon. The office pretty much ran itself. I had a fantastic sergeant who basically managed the place, and I let him do his job. The sergeant had seen action in Iraq and had been injured in an attack, but he had a real love for the Army and its traditions. This passion soon became infectious, and I gained a real insight into our Army history and traditions. I hadn't heard from Sam for a while. He was overseas, as he liked to put it. I worried for him, but I knew he was well trained, and as he said, when your time's up, it's up. This was the first time I felt really stable. I was studying for my degree, had set work hours, and was still boxing when I could. Funnily enough, it felt more like I worked for a bank than the Army. The only thing really missing from my life was a good woman. I was a romantic at heart and had dated a few women. While those relationships were enjoyable, I didn't have much in common with them, so they never lasted. This was all soon to change when I traveled back to my hometown for the weekend of a big music festival. I wanted to see my folks and Sam's family and maybe catch up with a few friends. While having a few brews on Friday night, I caught up with everyone and heard the latest news. My dad was considering selling the hardware store and retiring. Meanwhile, Sam's parents were supportive of his dad taking over as police chief, and they hadn't heard from Sam since everything was still hush-hush over there. I woke up early Saturday morning and went for my run. After showering and getting dressed, I enjoyed a nice breakfast prepared by my mom. I then helped my dad open the store, and that's when my life took a turn. Roger Easton. I turned around to see Susan Bates standing next to a gorgeous brunette. "Hey, Susan. How are you?" I replied. "I'm good, but it's Susan Peterson now," she said. I was surprised to hear that Doug had actually married her. She went on to explain that she was visiting with her cousin Kelly for the festival while Doug was overseas on a business trip. Susan introduced me to Kelly, who was stunning. I wondered what two beautiful women were doing in a hardware store, but apparently Susan had seen me and came in before their hair appointment next door. I promised to meet them at the festival to catch up. My dad saw the exchange and laughed, reminding me to watch myself as Susan was known to be flirtatious. I shrugged it off, thinking that I only had eyes for Kelly. After catching up with a few friends, I went home, cleaned up, had some lunch, and headed to the festival where the atmosphere was lively. Sure enough, I spotted Susan and Kelly. Kelly looked a bit uncomfortable as Susan flirted with every man who came close. I greeted Kelly with a smile, while Susan, clearly enjoying herself, gave me an enthusiastic kiss and said, "Looks like you need something to eat, Roger." I assured her I was fine. We found a table and I bought drinks and food for the three of us. For the next hour, I listened to Susan talk about her life. She shared that she married Doug right after graduation because he had gotten her pregnant, but fortunately she lost the baby early on. Doug was working in his father's business and frequently traveled for work as his father was in poor health and Doug would soon take over. After a while, Susan felt the tension and wandered off with Peter Morrison, the ex-police chief's son, to check out his new car. I laughed, thinking that was the last I'd see of her. Cousin Kelly asked what was so funny and I just said Susan hadn't changed much. I then enjoyed getting to know Kelly better. She was raised on an army base and worked as a human resources manager for a large corporation, clearly the Peterson Corporation, since Susan had helped her get a foot in the door. We talked about family, my work, and discovered we had a lot in common. We ended up going to dinner, and it was exciting to learn that we lived and worked in the same city. By the end of the night, we exchanged numbers and promised to meet again. That night, I fell asleep a very happy man. Things progressed rapidly from there. We started dating and grew closer. Before I knew it, we'd been together for almost 2 years. Kelly was old-fashioned and wanted to wait until marriage before being intimate. I agreed, but it became quite frustrating. On the plus side, we got to know each other very well. The only sour note was Susan Peterson's involvement in our lives and the shadow of Doug always lingering nearby. Kelly knew how I felt about Doug and Susan, but for her sake, I kept my opinions to myself. I met Kelly's family, and although I felt out of my league, they tolerated me. I think it helped that I was an officer in the Army, which gave me some common ground with Kelly's father, a retired general. After completing my degree, I proposed to Kelly and she accepted. I did the right thing and asked her father for permission, which he agreed to, but her mother was not too pleased and suggested I might be just a starter husband. My folks liked Kelly. She was down to earth, and even though she came from money, she didn't flaunt it. Of course, a prenuptial agreement was signed before the wedding at her mother's insistence. I had a feeling that somehow Doug Peterson had put this idea in Susan's head and it had been passed down to Kelly. The wedding went off well. Sadly, Sam couldn't be there as he was still uncontactable. I got his younger brother to stand in for him as best man. Thankfully, Doug was overseas and didn't come. It was a good day and an even better night as Kelly and I discovered we were as compatible in private as we were in public. Life continued as expected. We bought a nice house in a good neighborhood, enjoyed our time together, and started discussing the future. We both wanted kids, but first, I had to decide between the Army or a civilian lifestyle. In the end, we agreed I should use my degree and I started looking for a new career. I got lucky when a major bank needed someone to run their internal and external security. The job paid twice what I was making in the Army, so I submitted my resignation and moved on. We began trying for kids right away, but it just didn't happen. I knew I was under pressure and working longer hours, but I sensed there had to be more to it. After a visit to the doctor, I received the bad news. I was sterile. I dreaded telling Kelly as she really wanted children. I thought about looking into adoption, getting the facts, and maybe taking her on a cruise to break the news. However, that plan went awry when I surprised her with the cruise and she told me she had been promoted. She was now reporting directly to the CEO of Peterson Corporation, Mr. Doug Peterson. Doug had asked her, as the head of human resources, to accompany him on a tour of their businesses across the states for some layoffs. I felt uneasy about this, but what could I say? Kelly assured me Doug had changed from his high school days and was all business, but I had my doubts. The morning she left, Doug showed up in a limo with a big grin and a wave to me. Kelly kissed me goodbye and promised to call when she could. I spent the next few days sulking. When Kelly finally called, she insisted everything was fine and that Doug was completely professional. That Saturday morning, while having breakfast, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a well-tanned individual standing there, Sam. I couldn't believe my eyes. He looked different, more hardened and world-weary, but it was good to see each other again. We shared a hug and settled in for a drink. When he asked where Kelly was, I told him she was out of town on a business trip. I was more interested in hearing about his adventures. Sam told me about his travels and his time in the Special Forces. He had seen some intense situations. He then revealed he had left the Army tired of the killing. At 28, he felt he had done enough and wanted out. I caught him up on my life, including Kelly and her connection to Doug Peterson. We even shared a laugh about Susan marrying Doug. As the evening wore on, I showed him my wedding photos and he suddenly had a strange look on his face. "Holy, that's General Bates," he said. I was surprised he knew him and learned that he had been Sam's commander when he first joined Special Forces. Sam revealed some interesting tidbits about Mrs. Bates and her connections to some of the general's officers. I was taken aback by this revelation and questioned how the general could stay married to someone with such a reputation. Sam explained it was all about power and control. I asked Sam to stay the night, but he had to leave. He informed me he was reporting to the police academy for training on Monday. He was becoming a cop, like his father. He promised to come over when Kelly returned. I had a lot to think about. I was already concerned about Doug and Kelly's relationship, and now I learned that her mother had a questionable reputation just like her cousin Susan. The other thing that concerned me was Sam. He seemed different, having changed dramatically in both appearance and attitude. I hadn't seen him for nearly 10 years, so I figured I was being too harsh. People change, after all. He had just returned and everything was likely overwhelming for him. Meanwhile, I had more pressing troubles on my mind regarding Kelly and the revelations about her mother. The next week passed quickly as I kept busy at work, and Kelly called a couple of times. I was too preoccupied to dwell on my concerns about Doug and Kelly, knowing she would be back Friday night. Sure enough, around 8 p.m. that Friday, Kelly arrived home in a limo. She greeted me with a warm kiss and a hug, expressing how happy she was to see me. I looked for any signs of change in her mannerisms, but she seemed the same old Kelly. After she went upstairs for a shower, I took her bags to the laundry. Unable to resist, I glanced through her bags but found nothing out of the ordinary. We enjoyed a late dinner together and spent the night reconnecting. I loved this woman deeply. The next morning, we woke up around 10 a.m. and had a late breakfast. I caught Kelly up on Sam's return and expressed my desire for her to meet him. I called Sam and he promised to come over in the afternoon. Around 2 p.m. when he arrived, he brought flowers and a bottle of good wine. I was about to introduce him to Kelly when she exclaimed, "Oh my God, Greg. It's Sam." I was taken aback. It turned out they knew each other from the army base where her father had been in charge. For the next few hours, they caught up on their shared experiences and I felt like a third wheel. I ended up cooking dinner and came back into the living room just as I overheard them discussing something in hushed tones. Sam suddenly stood up to leave, mentioning that Kelly and I needed to talk first, leaving me curious about what had just transpired. Once he was gone, I asked Kelly what was going on. She seemed a bit embarrassed and revealed that she and Sam had briefly dated while he was stationed there. They had broken up when he left for a tour of duty. I couldn't help but feel uneasy about this revelation, especially when Sam's expression changed after looking at our wedding photos. It became clear that he still had feelings for her. I asked Kelly if this would be a problem, and she reassured me that she loved me and only me. Still, I was frustrated that neither of them had mentioned their past. I called Sam, who echoed Kelly's sentiments, explaining that he didn't want to upset or worry me with past events. Life continued, with Kelly busier than ever in her new role, and our plans for children took a backseat. I didn't mention my concerns about being sterile. Sam graduated and started his career as a police officer working in the drug squad. I was also busy with my job at the bank, but slowly things started changing at home. Our intimacy shifted from 3 times a week to once a week, and then it dwindled to once every couple of weeks. This coincided with Kelly's late nights at work with Doug and various overnight business trips. I sensed something was wrong. Determined to clear my head, I decided to take a week off to help my father, who had recently retired and sold his business. Kelly encouraged me, saying it would be a good opportunity since she had to work late with Doug and some other executives. I arrived at my parents' place on Monday around 10 a.m. After spending the day at the store, we went to the Irish pub for a few drinks. I tried to avoid discussing my worries until my dad surprised me with some unexpected advice. "Son, I think you should start protecting yourself ASAP," he said seriously. I asked him what he meant, and he looked me in the eye, revealing that there were rumors circulating around town. He explained that Doug Peterson was telling everyone that he was having an affair with Kelly. My anger boiled over. It was one thing to suspect infidelity, but to hear it directly was another. Everything began to add up, and I realized I had been naive. I couldn't shake my earlier question about how far an apple falls from the tree. I would make them all pay for making a fool of me. First things first, I was going to make an unannounced visit to Susan Peterson. The Bates estate was the biggest place in town, a mansion everyone called the White House because of its size. As I headed back to the city, I heard that Susan was actually at her parents' place. I knew her parents fairly well from when I dated their daughter in high school. They were decent people, but I knew they never considered me good enough for Susan. She often told me that her parents just wanted her to date me to get it out of her system. When I got to the main house, I found Susan sitting on the porch. "I heard a rumor you were in town. Trouble in paradise?" I said. "I could say the same to you," she replied. No, I'm just here to help my dad close up his business. Susan didn't look great, she seemed pale and nervous. She offered me a drink and a nice cold beer sounded perfect. So, what brings you here, she asked. I got straight to the point. Is Doug seeing my wife? Jesus, you don't mess around, Roger. Yeah, well, it's all around town, I said. Susan started crying and explained that she had left Doug and was now living back at her parents' house. Their divorce was only a matter of time. She told me they had been forced into marriage and resented each other. Doug had started seeing other women right away and didn't bother to hide it. In fact, she told me he had a nice apartment near his office where he brought his conquests. Being Susan, she retaliated by having affairs of her own. Doug had been pushing for a divorce for the last 2 years, but Susan held off on her mom's advice. Everything came to a head last week when Doug admitted he was sleeping with Kelly and said it wouldn't be long before Kelly moved in on his side of the bed. Enough was enough, and Susan packed up and left. As we talked more, she shed a few tears for Doug's role in my marriage problems, but I was beyond caring about sympathy from a Peterson or a Bates. Susan vowed to make Doug pay, but I wanted to ensure my revenge on my terms. I wished her well and hoped that would be the last time I ever spoke to her. When I got home, my folks were out for dinner and there was a note saying Kelly needed to talk urgently. I thought, screw that, grabbed a cold beer and headed out to the deck. I switched on my mobile phone and saw several missed calls and messages, but I couldn't deal with it today, so I switched it back off. My parents came home around 10 p.m. and by then I was on my 9th beer. The phone had been ringing nonstop all night, so I ended up taking it off the hook. Dad joined me for a beer and I staggered off to bed. The next morning, I woke up with a headache and the smell of bacon and eggs cooking. God bless all the mothers of the world. After breakfast, I headed to the store with Dad to do the final handover with the new owner. We said a sad farewell to the store and were back home in time for lunch. After lunch, Dad and I went fishing. We had a good talk and he agreed that I should confront this issue head-on and be done with it. The fish weren't biting, so we returned home early and Kelly's new BMW was parked in the driveway. I steadied myself and walked into the house with Dad. Kelly was in the lounge with a box of tissues talking to my mom. My mom looked at me and asked Dad to take her to the store, then they would visit their friends, the Browns, for dinner. Once they left, I asked Kelly if she wanted a drink. She said no, so I got a beer from the fridge. As I returned, Kelly ran into my arms and started crying, saying she needed to talk to me. She began by explaining that Susan had called her yesterday about the impending divorce and wanted to thank her for making me available again. Kelly was confused about what Susan meant, so she immediately started calling me, leaving endless messages, none of which I returned. After a few days, Kelly drove straight to my parents' place to talk. As the waterworks started again, I had steeled myself for the truth. I asked her outright if she was having an affair with Doug. Kelly swore she wasn't, claiming their late meetings included several other executives. I confronted her about the rumors around town and she was ready for that too. She insisted it wasn't Doug starting those rumors, but Susan, who wanted to break us up. Kelly claimed that Susan still loved me and only broke up with me in high school due to the pressure placed on her by her parents. She also said she had spoken with Doug and would no longer be attending any late-night meetings. While the story sounded good in theory, I thought it was a bunch of nonsense. Firstly, I'm no expert on women, but I knew Susan did not love me. I was just a fleeting interest during high school. Susan loved money and power, and I offered neither. Secondly, I knew Doug Peterson, and he hated me. He would do anything to spite me. Thirdly, the women Doug dated had a track record of infidelity. No, this was a fantasy, and I needed evidence to confront her. In my mind, Kelly was now the enemy, but I had to play my cards close to my chest and let her believe all was forgiven and that I was no longer suspicious. I gave Kelly a kiss and a hug, and suffice it to say, the performance I put on made it seem like all was soon forgiven. I took Kelly out for dinner that night, and thankfully she was too tired for anything more intimate. The next morning, she left early, happy and smiling. After talking to my folks about Christmas arrangements, I told her I loved her and would see her in a couple of days. After we finalized the arrangements with the store, Dad looked at me funny but was smart enough not to say anything. With Kelly gone, I placed a call to Sam. It was time to get him involved in the surveillance on Kelly. I left him a message saying it was urgent we talk. While waiting for my friend to call back, I had a quiet word with Dad and asked him to tell Kelly that I was staying there until Sunday. Knowing Kelly would be at work, I left a message on the answering machine at home saying I would be at my folks' place until Sunday as Dad still needed further help with the store. With that done, I packed my car, said goodbye, and headed back to the city. Sam still hadn't returned my call, but no matter. I got back to the city in the mid-afternoon and checked into a hotel close enough to work but far enough away that I wouldn't run into anyone I knew or, more importantly, anyone Kelly knew. Once I checked in, I went into work to say hello and asked my boss if I could have another week off. He told me it was no problem. While at the bank, I organized a new bank account in my name only and transferred half of our joint savings into my account, ensuring all future pay would go there. I felt a bit better having some walk-around money and enough for any unexpected costs that might arise. I then went back to the hotel and tried Sam again, but still no luck. I decided to go down to the bar for a cold beer. I started talking with the bartender when my phone rang. I excused myself and answered. It was just my dad checking to see that I got back to the city okay. I returned to talking with the bartender and had a few more drinks. By 2 p.m. I decided 3 beers were enough, paid my tab, and left. I went back to my room, had a shower, changed clothes, and decided to have a late lunch. Just as I left my room, my phone rang again. It was Sam. He apologized for taking so long, but work came first as he had just been made a detective. I must say, it seemed awfully quick for him to achieve that, but he was well trained. I asked Sam if he was free. He laughed and said he had just finished work, so we decided to meet at a local bar. When I got to the bar, I found out it was a local cop hangout. We found a booth at the back and ordered a couple of beers. After our beers came, I sat down and explained my concerns to my friend. I told him about Kelly and Doug, the rumors, the trips away, the apartment building, and Kelly's change in attention toward me. Sam took it all in stride, sipped his beer, and then asked, "Left or right knee?" "I'll take care of him for you." I started laughing and told him I'd rather deal with Doug directly. We then got down to serious business. First off, I had to play it cool and keep Kelly clueless, continuing to act as if everything was normal. Next, we needed evidence or confirmation that she was involved with Doug. Then we would confront him. Sam told me to leave it with him. He knew some people and would get back to me with the required information. He admitted he was surprised as he didn't pick Kelly as someone who would cheat. I responded that neither did I, or I wouldn't have married her. We then proceeded to catch up, reminiscing about the old days until the wee hours of the morning. I woke up Friday morning with a huge hangover and an urge to vomit. After a shower and breakfast, I started to feel somewhat human again. I remembered Sam saying that I should act normally around Kelly and be the same loving husband. Based on that, I canceled my leave for the following week and called Kelly to tell her I would be home that night. I was welcomed home with open arms, had a nice dinner, and attempted to be intimate with my wife. She questioned why I wanted to use protection and then talked me out of it. Kelly told me she was ready for children and that we should start that night. I remained silent, knowing she wouldn't be getting any children from me. Life continued and I was on pins and needles, awaiting Sam to get back to me. It's hard to plan for the future when you don't know if you're doing it alone. A couple of weeks later, Kelly phoned me, questioning our joint bank account balance. I fabricated a story about lending money to my dad and assured her that when he sold the house, we would get the money back. She seemed satisfied with that answer. As the weeks dragged on into a month, my worry grew. I left a few messages for Sam, but he urged me not to worry, saying he was onto something. With Christmas fast approaching, I wanted this sorted out before the end of the year. Early in December, I received a call from Sam asking to meet. We ended up back at the cop hangout, ironically in the same booth. Sam was all smiles, which eased my tension. After some small talk, he passed over an envelope. "Open it, it's good news," he said. Inside was a private investigation report on Kelly Easton and a thicker one on Doug Peterson. The good news was that Kelly was in the clear. She had been followed for a month and the report showed she went from home to work, had lunch with girlfriends, and returned home each day. I was the only man in her life, apart from our 2-year-old border collie, Buddy. Doug Peterson, however, was a different story. The report revealed he was a notorious playboy involved in questionable activities to support a growing gambling and drug habit. Sam knew his supplier, and Doug was on the verge of being busted for cocaine. I couldn't have asked for a better Christmas present. I celebrated with drinks at the bar and headed home to my loving wife. When I got home, Kelly was affectionate and we shared a passionate evening. Afterward, she turned to me and said she had a surprise. "Darling, you're going to be a father." I looked stunned, processing her words. She misinterpreted my expression as joy, beaming at me while I felt a mix of disbelief and concern. Kelly started talking about nursery preparations and maternity leave, but I zoned out. Realizing I had been made a fool of was disheartening, but I quickly gathered my thoughts. The army had taught me to be logical, so I figured things out swiftly. The only question was what I was going to do about it. I felt physically ill lying next to Kelly that night. One thing was clear, she was out for herself and I needed to act. I couldn't believe she would pass off the baby as ours. Our intimacy had been practically non-existent. Tossing and turning for hours, I watched Kelly sleep peacefully, and I felt a surge of anger. Instead of dwelling on my frustrations, I went downstairs to my study. I glanced at my gun but dismissed such thoughts as weak. Over the years, I came to some hard truths. The baby wasn't mine, my wife had betrayed me, Sam was my worst enemy, and Doug Peterson had been set up by Sam. Coming to terms with my life being a lie was excruciating. It felt terrible to be surrounded by enemies. I was a loyal and trusting person. Was that a crime? I needed to make quick decisions. Taking Sam's advice to heart, I knew I had to make everyone think I was oblivious while sorting this out tactically. I had to speak to Doug Peterson. With that decision made, I returned to bed, attempting to find some rest. I woke early the next morning, filled with purpose. Kelly was still asleep, so I quietly left for the day. As soon as I got to work, I called Peterson Corporation and left a message for Doug to call me urgently. By mid-morning, it was clear he wouldn't be returning my call. I couldn't risk going to his office due to Kelly working there, so I made a hasty decision, hoping it would pan out. I told my colleagues I would be out of the office for the rest of the day and instructed them to contact me only in matters of life or death. I went next door to Hertz, rented a large SUV, and waited outside Doug's office, sipping coffee in the rental. I saw Doug Peterson emerge from his office and hop into his new BMW Z4 Roadster. Discreetly, I followed him until he stopped outside an apartment building. Before he could enter, I pulled up, jumped out, and confronted him. In hindsight, my actions might have seemed extreme, but at the time I thought it was a clever move. As we left the apartment building behind, I noticed Doug was visibly shaken. He looked as pale as a ghost, probably fearing I intended to harm him. "Roger, please don't kill me. I swear I didn't touch Kelly," Doug pleaded, his voice trembling. "Jesus, get a hold of yourself, man," I replied. "I left you a message and you didn't get back to me, so you kidnapped me? I don't want to die." His reaction was so dramatic it reminded me of a child who had just dropped their ice cream. Given our mutual disdain, I understood his fear. I knew I had to get to a safe place for a serious conversation, so I drove out of the city toward a lake where we could talk privately. However, as soon as I turned down the road, his panic returned. I could hardly believe this guy was a CEO of a large corporation. After calming him down, I brought him to a picnic bench to discuss a report that Sam had compiled. "Read this and then we'll talk for the next 15 minutes, I instructed. As Doug read through the report, he made comments like, "This is no way accurate." I responded, "What do you think, Doug?" "It's complete nonsense. This has Susan's fingerprints all over it," he said. I wanted him to realize he was entangled with an enemy who was closing in on him. "It wasn't Susan who gave me the report, it was Greg Sands," I revealed. Doug turned even paler, now convinced I was out to get him. I surprised Doug by telling him I didn't believe the report except for the fact that he most likely cheated on his wife. I stunned him further when I suggested we help each other. Lies were clearly part of the agenda. Despite being a weak figurehead in his father's company, Doug had a reputation as a playboy, primarily involved with escorts. His father still called the shots, pulling the strings behind the scenes. I delivered the shocking news: he had to leave town immediately or risk spending the rest of his life in prison. I explained that Sam was planning to plant drugs, leading to a very public arrest. "Why are you helping me? And why is Greg Sands trying to destroy me?" he asked. The first part was easy. I needed his father's connections to dig up a full background on Sam, including his current activities. Doug made the call to arrange an urgent flight out of the country and then contacted his father to explain the situation. He surprised me by handing the phone to me. Mr. Peterson Sr. begrudgingly assured me I would receive a full report on Greg Sands within a few days. The second question was trickier, and I shrugged, saying I couldn't provide insight into why Sam was targeting him. I secretly believed it was Sam's twisted way of retaliating against me for my own marital issues. I sat with Doug for an hour while we waited for his father's people to collect him. He was eager to leave the country as quickly as possible. Soon, a large black SUV arrived to take Doug away. I knew Sam would be furious about not being able to find Doug quickly, but hopefully this would give me time to understand what was happening. I drove back to the city and returned the rental, knowing I had to play it cool and await the report that would hopefully provide insight and leverage against Sam. In the meantime, I needed to escape the tension. I couldn't stand to be around Sam or Kelly. Back at work, I spoke with my boss, who had been urging me to visit the regional office for training. Before long, I had a ticket for a flight and was off on my whirlwind 2-week adventure at the regional office. Kelly was upset about my sudden absence until I reminded her that I needed to keep my boss happy, especially with the baby on the way, which silenced her. The 2 weeks passed quickly and I made several attempts to reach Peterson Sr. regarding the report, but to no avail. Imagine my surprise on the last day of my tour when a courier delivered a thick package to me. Peterson Sr. had tracked me down with ease. Finally, I had the report on Greg Sands and I would have one night to digest it and formulate a plan of action. It took me half the night to read the report. Several times I had to put it down and have a slug of straight whiskey. The contents shook me to my very core. I might have known my friend Sam at 18, but the person at 28 was a sick, twisted individual. The report gave me all the answers I was looking for, and I was thankful I wasn't the target of his rage. I was sure Peterson Sr. had read this report and must have had a good laugh, feeling like a kid at Christmas watching the Bates clan crumble. My guess is Peterson Sr. wasn't thrilled about the scandal that would erupt with the upcoming divorce of Doug and Susan, not to mention his precious boy being set up. What hurt me the most, however, apart from my wife's infidelity, was that if I was reading this report correctly, I was just a pawn, nothing more than collateral damage in a power struggle between two men that started years ago. Having the answers gave me no relief. In fact, I was certain I would become a target if Sam figured out that I knew everything. There's no doubt that he would kill me if he got wind of my knowledge. The report detailed everything from Sam's childhood right up to his police career. I learned that as a child, Sam was exposed to a high level of violence. I didn't know that his mother was actually his stepmother. The report outlined that Greg had witnessed his real mother's death at the hands of an intruder. His father had just returned from work as the man was about to shoot Greg, and his father saved the day by killing the intruder. Details were a little fuzzy from then on. Greg got into trouble fighting other kids, and eventually his father remarried and continued his police career. To control Greg's rage, his father enrolled him in boxing classes and he became a champion boxer. His father then took a new job in my hometown, and during that period I knew mostly everything as we were joined at the hip. There were no real amazing insights until Greg Sands joined the army. This was the part of the report that became clear to me and made me realize I had to get out of the middle of this. I knew all about basic training as we went through that together. The most interesting reading was when Sam completed his Special Forces training. The key to this whole tale of woe came down to one man, General Edward Bates, who was in charge of Sam's unit. This is where I realized I had been sold a bunch of lies. Sam was in charge of his unit and reported directly to Bates. They took an instant dislike to each other. Bates had a win-at-all-costs philosophy, and while Sam had that in him, he believed in being righteous and loved the men under his command. Apparently, Bates and Sam had some blazing disagreements on everything from tactics to Sam's relationship with his daughter, Kelly. Initially, Sam got together with Kelly just to spite Bates. What was interesting was that Kelly looked very similar in build and appearance to Sam's deceased mother. The report provided photos and I had to admit there were some similarities, but nothing as remarkable as identical twins. It seems the love affair turned serious quickly as Sam was smitten and so was Kelly. However, things turned ugly when Sam proposed to Kelly, but she refused until he asked her father's permission. Well, hell would freeze over before that happened. As quick as that, Sam's unit was sent to the Middle East. General Bates initially went over in charge of several operations, albeit organizing them from a desk in the desert. Sam and his boys were given every dangerous mission that Bates could find. Men lost their lives, but Bates persisted until he went too far. General Bates ordered Sam's unit into a very dangerous situation, apparently knowing that the information they had was outdated and incorrect. The report suggested he was aware of the risks. The squad was supposed to be going on R&R, but Bates canceled it and ordered them in. It was a disaster, with half the unit cut down and most of the rest coming back with injuries, including Sam. General Bates was ordered home, where he resigned and retired. Sam recovered physically, but mentally he had changed and swore revenge. By the time he came home, Bates was retired and gone. To add further insult to injury, Kelly broke his heart, refusing marriage based on her father's demands. Kelly was quoted as saying she would always love him and no other man, but she had to follow her father's wishes. Sam continued his military career but then heard about my marriage to Miss Kelly Bates. With that, Sam saw his chance for more than a little revenge. He decided to quit the military and become a cop in my city. I was as much of a consideration to him as gum on the bottom of his shoe. He knew he could woo Kelly, hopefully get her pregnant, and destroy her reputation. I was simply a stepping stone. When he didn't return to Kelly soon enough, she married me. Kelly never intended for our relationship to last long term, but she endured it, hoping that one day Sam would come back. Surprisingly, much of the information in the report came from Susan Peterson. Kelly must have foolishly confided in her, not realizing that Susan's bitterness over Doug's death would make her betray Kelly's trust. This report allowed me to piece together the true sequence of events. When Sam returned to civilian life, he sought revenge not only on Bates but also on me. He resumed his relationship with Kelly, which led to her pregnancy. Kelly had dropped enough hints to make me believe she was having an affair with Doug Peterson, hoping I would either confront him or divorce her, thereby clearing the way for her to be with Sam. The plan grew ambitious when I approached Sam for help. He easily manipulated the situation, playing both sides. When Kelly told me she was pregnant, it exposed her unfaithfulness. I suspected Sam was the father, which pushed me to confront Doug. Sam, desperate to maintain his plan, set Doug up to be discredited. When I helped Doug escape, Sam's scheme started to crumble. The video he sent me was meant to provoke me, but it only motivated me to act more cautiously. Now, with Kelly pregnant, Sam believed he had one. But I knew the truth. I needed to figure out my next move before things escalated any further. With my next steps in mind, I called Brian Moses, my old sergeant from the Army History Unit. He had always been a reliable friend, and I trusted him more than anyone else. I explained the situation to him without going into unnecessary detail, hinting at the danger but keeping specifics vague. "Brian, I need to disappear for a while," I said. There was a pause on the other end before he replied. "I figured as much. Where are you now?" After a brief exchange of logistics, he agreed to help me. Brian suggested I come to his beach house, a secluded spot far from prying eyes. He had some connections that could help with a new identity if things got too heated. I knew I couldn't stay in the city any longer. The closer I was to Kelly and Sam, the greater the risk. By staying away, I could better plan my next moves. After gathering my essentials, I left a short note for Kelly saying I needed to sort some things out alone, and then packed up and drove out of town. As I hit the highway, I felt a strange sense of relief, as if I had just escaped from a cage. Arriving at Brian's place, I found it just as I remembered, simple, quiet, and surrounded by nature. Brian was waiting for me with a beer in hand. "You look like hell," he said. I laughed, feeling the tension ease for the first time in weeks. "You have no idea," I replied. We sat down on the porch and I laid out the story from start to finish, my suspicions about Kelly, Sam's involvement, Doug's escape, and the real danger I now faced. Brian listened intently, his expression becoming more serious as I went on. "You're in deep, Roger," he finally said. "But you're not alone." I nodded, grateful for his support. "I need a plan, Brian. I can't keep running forever, but I need to stay hidden until I can figure out how to take down Sam." Brian offered me a temporary hideout in a remote cabin he owned. It was about a 2-hour drive from the beach house, deep in the woods and rarely visited by anyone. "You can lay low there for a while. I'll arrange for the basics, food, water, and a way to communicate securely," he assured me. With the plan set, I left for the cabin the next morning, taking a few essentials and using Brian's old truck to avoid being traced. The cabin was exactly what I needed, isolated, surrounded by dense forest, and completely off the grid. For the next few weeks, I focused on regaining my strength, training daily with the boxing gloves I brought and going on long runs through the woods. I felt my body become stronger, leaner, and sharper. I also spent time analyzing the information from Peterson Sr.'s report, searching for any clues that could give me the upper hand against Sam. As the days passed, I kept a close eye on the news for any updates about Kelly or Sam. Kelly's pregnancy was now public knowledge, and rumors swirled around the nature of her relationship with Sam. Meanwhile, Doug Peterson's sudden disappearance had sparked whispers of scandal, but nothing concrete. I knew it was only a matter of time before Sam realized I was still alive. The more I thought about it, the clearer my plan became. I needed to bait Sam into revealing himself, to force a confrontation on my terms. I decided to take the next step and make a direct move. I called Brian, asking him to arrange a meeting with Peterson Sr. I needed more information about Sam's current activities and any potential weaknesses I could exploit. Peterson Sr. agreed to meet me at a secure location, a private estate he owned outside the city. I made the long drive to the estate, keeping a low profile along the way. When I arrived, I was led into a dimly lit study where Peterson Sr. sat behind a large oak desk. He was thinner and more gaunt than the last time I had seen him, a result of the stress from recent events. "I didn't expect to see you again, Easton," he said, his voice low and tired. "But I'm glad you're not dead." I nodded, getting straight to the point. "I need to know everything you have on Greg Sands. I need to stop him before he destroys everything I have left." Peterson Sr. seemed to consider my request for a moment before nodding. "Fine. I'll give you what you need, but I want something in return. I want you to take him down for good." I agreed, knowing that it was the only way forward. Peterson Sr. handed me a thick dossier filled with information about Sam's recent activities, including shady deals, corrupt law enforcement connections, and evidence of violent crimes he had committed. It was more than I had hoped for, but it also confirmed what I feared. Sam was a dangerous man capable of anything. Armed with this new information, I returned to the cabin and began to strategize. The final showdown was coming, and I needed to be ready. For the next few days, I meticulously planned my approach, mapping out potential scenarios and rehearsing different tactics. I knew Sam well enough to anticipate his moves, but I couldn't afford to underestimate him. When the time was right, I placed a call to Sam using a burner phone Brian had given me. "Roger," he answered, sounding both surprised and curious. "Long time, no see." I kept my voice steady. "I know you're looking for me, Greg. Let's end this once and for all." Sam laughed, a cold and humorless sound. "So, you've finally grown a spine. Where do you want to meet?" I suggested a remote location outside of town, a place we both knew well from our youth. It was where we used to spar and train, hidden deep in the woods. "Perfect," Sam replied. "Let's settle this like old times." I hung up, feeling a strange mix of fear and determination. This was it, the moment I had been preparing for. On the day of the meeting, I arrived early, hiding among the trees and keeping an eye on the clearing. I waited for over an hour, my senses alert for any movement. Finally, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching. Sam emerged from the trees, looking as confident as ever. He was dressed in black, with a gun holstered at his side. "It's good to see you, Roger," he said, his eyes cold and calculating. "I was hoping you'd have the guts to face me." I stepped out of the shadows, my own gun drawn and ready. "This ends here, Greg," I said. "No more games, no more lies." Sam smirked, drawing his weapon in response. "I couldn't agree more," he replied. The next few moments were a blur of gunfire and chaos. We exchanged shots, each trying to outmaneuver the other. I felt a bullet graze my arm, the pain sharp but manageable. I pressed on, focusing on my training and instincts. Sam was fast, but I was determined. Suddenly, I saw an opening. I aimed carefully and fired, hitting Sam square in the chest. He staggered back, a look of shock on his face. You actually did it," he muttered, collapsing to the ground. I stood over him, my gun still trained on him. "It's over," I said, feeling a mix of relief and sadness. "You lost." Sam coughed, blood trickling from his mouth. "Maybe," he whispered, "but you'll never be free of this." With that, he drew a knife from his belt and lunged at me, using the last of his strength. I reacted instinctively, dodging the blade and delivering a final shot to his head. Sam fell to the ground, lifeless. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily and processing what had just happened. It was finally over, the nightmare that had haunted me for so long was gone. As I made my way back to the cabin, I felt a strange sense of closure. I had lost so much, my marriage, my innocence, my best friend, but I had survived. I knew it would take time to heal, but at least I could now begin to rebuild my life. I returned to Brian's beach house, where he was waiting with a cold beer and a knowing smile. "It's done," I said simply. "Good," he replied. "Now let's get you a new start." And so, I began the process of creating a new life, leaving the past behind. I knew I could never completely erase the scars, but I was determined to move forward. With Brian's help, I adopted a new identity and relocated to a different state, starting fresh. I kept in touch with my family from a distance, ensuring they were safe. In the end, I realized that life is a series of battles, some won and some lost. But the key is to keep fighting, no matter what. I may have lost many things along the way, but I had gained something far more valuable, the will to survive.